How do you know whether or not the earnest money deposit is refundable? There are different circumstances that come up periodically, and I get asked as a broker very often, is the deposit still refundable? So let's talk about the earnest money deposit in just a few slides here, and when we're done with this short presentation, I think you'll have a very good understanding of when it's refundable and when it's not. So let's start with the EMD, typically between 1 and 3% of the sales price deposited in escrow. And the reason it's in escrow is you have this money not just as a gesture that the buyer's actually putting some money down to get the transaction started and open that escrow account, but also that the seller knows that in possession of escrow, the neutral third party, exists a deposit that will compensate that seller if the buyer breaches. Now, this question about the refundability of the EMD doesn't usually come up until the buyer, for whatever reason, doesn't complete either a task or the transaction in general, which is effectively breaching the purchase agreement. So we see it typically when contingencies are removed or when a buyer doesn't close escrow, and we're going to address both those scenarios. Now, as a seller, if the buyer is not performing, the first question is, are there any buyer contingencies in place currently? The big three are the appraisal contingency, the loan contingency, and the inspection contingency. The seller needs to ask, are any of these still active? Because if they are, the buyer is going to get their deposit back. And I'll explain. Sometimes I get a question where the agent will say, look, the buyer's contingencies expired 3 days ago, and the buyer won't even answer our calls. The seller wants to cancel and take their deposit. And I say, okay, well, if there's a contingency in place, it doesn't automatically expire. Now, the period that they have until they're supposed to remove the contingency, now that's what's expiring. However, that contingency stays in place indefinitely, only until the buyer removes that contingency in writing. And this has come up a few times where the seller gives the buyer more time to remove the contingency, and they don't put a notice to perform, which I'm going to explain how the seller can put pressure on the buyer and protect themselves, because the buyer has a lot of wiggle room in a transaction, whereas a seller does not. So the seller is going to wait and wait and wait. And if the buyer never removes contingencies, the seller might eventually throw their hands up and say, you know what, I've given this buyer 2 weeks to remove all contingencies or 2 weeks to close escrow, and they still haven't done it. I'm fed up, I'm canceling, and I want their deposit. They've maybe wait 5 weeks. So this is a conversation I'll hear sometimes. And I'll say, unless the buyer removed those contingencies, they're entitled to a refund. Yes, even if they've gone weeks after they should have removed contingencies or weeks after they should have closed escrow. As the seller and the listing agent, it's your obligation to enforce that with a notice to perform or a demand to close. And I'll explain. In the middle of the transaction, during the transaction, that buyer is supposed to remove contingencies when that period expires. If they don't, they continue on. So what should a seller do? Well, if the contingency's not been removed, the seller sends a notice to buyer to perform. And that says to the buyer, listen, you need to remove your contingencies and make your deposit non-refundable. Here's a 2-day notice. Now, if a seller sends that on a Monday, let's say, they have to wait Tuesday, Wednesday, and then on Thursday, the seller can cancel if the buyer hasn't performed the task. But they have to wait 2 days, and it doesn't start the day that they send it. Again, Monday, you wait Tuesday, Wednesday, those are the 2 days, and then Thursday is when, Thursday bright and early, or in the middle of the night, whatever you want. Thursday, you can cancel as the seller. Now, did the buyer ever remove their contingencies? If the answer is no, the buyer still gets their deposit back. Just because the seller sent a buyer to perform, a notice of buyer to perform, doesn't mean the seller gets the deposit. Because if the buyer never removed contingencies, it's still refundable to the buyer. That notice to perform just allows the seller to cancel. Otherwise, the seller would be trapped in the transaction. And if you want to know more about cancellation, I have a separate video you can watch all about canceling a contract, the Carform CC. Now, what happens if the buyer doesn't close escrow? Well, you have the same sort of form as the notice to perform, but it's the demand to close escrow, the CAR form DCE, and that is sent with a 3-day waiting period. So if a seller sends it on Monday, they have to wait Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday morning, the seller can cancel. Now, here's the thing. If the buyer doesn't close and that demand to close escrow has been sent by the seller, does the seller get the deposit? Again, we need to ask, did the buyer remove contingencies? If the answer is yes, then the seller is entitled to the deposit because there are no contingencies. If the buyer never removed contingencies, then that deposit's still refundable to the buyer, even though the seller's been dragged along the charade for a few weeks. So now you see how imperative it is that contingency periods are enforced by the seller and listing agent. It's paramount, or else the deposit's basically refundable all the time. Now, of course, there are exceptions to all this because an RPA can be modified with text to do virtually anything or for any sort of scenario. But I'm telling you, speaking as if I grabbed a random RPA, this is how it's filled out customarily. This is the default verbiage. And I'm explaining that without contingencies removed, that deposit's refundable. I'm just telling you how the seller gets out. Now, again, if there's a demand to close escrow, likely the buyer has removed contingencies if they've gotten that far, and the seller's entitled to that deposit. Now, escrow cannot release the deposit unless both parties sign off instructing escrow to release it. So what do you think happens when the seller says, hey, buyer, you breached, you didn't close escrow? I'm taking your deposit now. Do you think do you think the buyer just says, okay, no problem, here you are, and I'll sign off and give you my deposit? No, buyers almost always don't cooperate, and they will typically ignore the seller or ask for the deposit back or make some big fuss. And ultimately, this will lead to dispute resolution. So what happens when there's a stalemate? Well, by default, the purchase agreement stipulates that both parties agree to go to mediation and talk it out and come to some sort of agreement. That could be splitting the deposit 50-50. That could be splitting it any other way. Or maybe the seller just walks away and gives it back to the buyer because they feel sorry for him. Or maybe the buyer realizes that they have no alternative and they give up to the seller. But mediation needs to happen first. And that's where the parties resolve it on their own. Now, what happens if that fails and they still can't come to a resolution? Well, the next step is arbitration, and that is a legally binding outcome. The arbitrator will issue an award to one of the parties that's effectively an order, a court order in essence, that is going to be able to instruct escrow to disperse to the winning party. So again, escrow needs either mutually signed disbursement instructions or the arbitration award or court order to disperse escrow, to disperse the EMD to one of the parties. Often I see that parties work it out before it comes to this. But if they don't, the seller needs to either go through mediation, arbitration, or just sue the buyer. If you bypass mediation, arbitration, then you're unable to recover attorney's fees from the other party that's one of the provisions of the agreement. But if the deposit's stuck in escrow and one of the parties is clearly entitled to it, then this is the solution to get it out. And you don't even need some expensive trial attorney. You just go to small claims, depending on the amount of the deposit, or you could hire just some budget attorney because it's all spelled out so clearly in the purchase agreement. This isn't going to take a lot of legal maneuvering to get it done. And that's it. That's what you need: a court order, arbitration award, or mutually signed escrow instructions. That's the bottom half of the CAR form CC, instructing escrow to release that deposit. But the parties can negotiate this on their own if they don't have to, if they're not compelled to go to mediation or argue it out entirely. So I hope this helps and you have a clear understanding now at this point of when an EMD is refundable and when it's not. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thanks again.